Today's video has been brought to you by Meso CNC Controllers. Well, hello again everyone. Today I'll be attempting to restore and customize this previously child customized Corvette Stingray. I'm not really sure what year this particular Stingray was produced, at least not at this point, but I would guess late 70s, early 80s. Now this car was sent to me by a subscriber named Robert who sent me his entire childhood collection of Hot Wheels. So I'll assume that Robert applied the current paint job on this Vette. If you watch my videos, you know I always like getting cars that are covered in paint, especially red lines. The paint preserves the original paint and the metal underneath and sort of creates a time capsule. If the child painted the car early in the car's life, then there might be a mint car under all the paint. Most of the time, however, the kids paint the cars that are already beat up. Now what they painted the car in is really important. At first glance, I felt this car was painted in latex. If that was the case, there is a chance I could remove the latex without harming the original enamel paint below. So the first thing I did was drop the car in some brake fluid. Brake fluid will typically attack latex but not enamel, at least not very well. But more importantly, brake fluid will not attack the plastic for the interior or the windshield. I left the car in the brake fluid for over an hour and then pulled it out. Unfortunately, it had no effect on the paint. So I could only assume the paint was not latex, or it's latex that's so old the brake fluid wouldn't work anymore. Next I tried some goof off in a paper towel. This sort of worked, however I found that it would remove the paint right down to the metal. Thus my dream of a mint Stingray were pretty much shattered. So I might as well just go ahead and take this car apart and make the best out of this situation. After drilling out the post, I flipped the body over to see what color the car originally was, only to discover no paint at all. I was figuratively scratching my head at this time because normally there's at least some overspray to give you a clue as to the original color, but in this case, I couldn't find any at all. This had me wondering if this was a super chrome version, as those don't have any paint inside either. The clear blue plastic windshield and interior were used on the super chrome versions, but they were also pretty much used on all the Stingrays as the windshield and interior were molded as one piece that is folded over, so all early Hong Kong Stingrays have blue clear plastic interiors. All that I could do now is remove the paint and see what color came off the body. And upon doing so, I found that the color under the white paint was red. Mattel made two different red Corvettes in black walls that I know of, one in 1975 and another around 1980. Neither of them are rare or expensive, but of course that's sort of irrelevant at this point as the car is about to be completely stripped of all of its paint and value, if it had any to begin with. Once the paint was removed, I sanded the car down, cleaning up some of the flashing and making sure all the paint was gone. I'm going to skip showing the sanding as I've shown that dozens of times in previous videos. Instead, I want to focus in this video on getting a really good paint job on this casting. So once I have the sanding done, I'll spray on some surface primer. The first layer of primer is really meant to show the imperfections in the body and things that you might not see while sanding. What I like to do is try and sand off all the primer that I just sprayed on. Doing this will allow the primer to fill in all the pits and issues on the surface. For example, this car had some pits on the hood that the primer filled in. Once I've tried to remove all the primer with sandpaper, I'll then wash the car and let it dry. I will then spray on another layer of primer and then check for any imperfections. In most cases, this second layer of primer is perfect, as the first layer filled in all the issues. If for some reason I still see problems, then I'll resand the body again, trying to remove all the primer I can. Once I'm done, I will reprime the body and recheck for issues. Anyway, once all this back and forth is done, you should be left with a perfectly smooth body ready for paint. Now that the car is ready to paint, I need to prepare my paint booth. I tend to have issues with dust getting on my paint, and I feel that I've traced this down to paint particles in my paint booth. Airbrushes atomize the paint coming off the needle of the airbrush. This paint tends to stay wet as it hits the object you're painting, however the overspray will tend to dry before it hits anything. This overspray turns into a dust that covers the paint booth. These particles can then be kicked up later by the airbrush and land on the item you're painting. To minimize this issue, I'll clean out my paint booth with a can of air and a wet paper towel. I tend to do this 3 times to be sure all the paint dust is gone. And just before I begin to paint, I'll lightly spray down the inside of the paint booth with some tap water. This will act as a bit of insurance. If there's any dust left on the surface, the water will hold it in place. Also, any dust that forms during my painting session will also get caught by the water's surface tension and held in place. I should note I'm not drenching everything down here, it's just a light misting. Now just before I paint, I will wet sand the body with some 2000 grit sandpaper. This will knock off any dust or imperfections that might be on the surface of the primer. I will then wash the car with some dish soap and water and then blow the water off with a can of air or the air out of a clean airbrush. I will then set the car aside to air dry. I will not use any towel to dry the car so that no lint or other particles can get stuck on the surface. For this car, I'm painting it in a black urethane paint I got from the Redline shop, links below. The paint is mixed 6:1 with hardener, so 6 drops of paint to 1 drop of hardener. I get asked a lot if I have to thin the paint, and I do not. Urethane paints are normally much thinner than acrylics, and I usually find that thinning is unnecessary. Urethane is a great paint to start learning on, as dry tip and thinning are almost non-issues. The only downside is that you have to take proper precautions as far as breathing vapors goes, which you should be doing with paints anyway. To get the best results while spraying with an airbrush, always start spraying before you pass over the car. This way, any dry paint that might have formed on the needle tip will be blown off and miss the object you're painting. If you begin spraying right over the car, the dry paint will be fired onto the surface and will have to be sanded off later. As far as coats go, I was able to paint this car in 3 coats, but I would consider 2 coats the minimum, with the first coat acting as a tack coat. However many coats you apply, the last coat should be a wet coat. A wet coat is a heavier coat that is applied until the paint on the surface is wet. This is required to get that glossy look the urethane paint provides. When done, I let the casting sit overnight with a box over the top to ensure that no dust particles land on the surface. You can see here how the paint came out when I was done. All in all, this looks good to me, especially for black paint, which tends to show any imperfections. Now I'm going to add a top coat of this color changing metal flake from the Redline shop. This is a blue-purple flake, which makes the paint look blue or purple depending on the angle you're viewing the surface. The flake is applied the same way as normal Spectraflame paint and uses the same 6:1 ratio to paint and hardener. The only difference is that you apply the flake very lightly over the black Spectraflame paint. This makes for a very subtle effect that looks amazing when it's dry. In fact, I had to show the effect off outside, as my filming setup is done in a way to limit glare and makes the color change hard to see, but outside it's much more apparent. Also, cameras don't do so well with similar colors next to each other, so the car looks much better in person than on the video. Alright, let's turn our attention to the windshield. I might be able to remove the paint from the windshield with different chemicals, but in the end I decided to just go with sanding it off. I've already put a lot of work into the body of this car and would hate to ruin the windshield. So I would start by sanding off the paint with some 400 grit sandpaper. The paint is sanding off with ease compared to the paint on the body, so I didn't end up spending as much time on this as I expected. Once all the paint is off, I switched over to some 1500 grit sandpaper and removed all the 400 grit lines. I say this a lot and I'll say it again here. You can skip grits when sanding soft materials like this plastic. Last, I will polish the plastic with a buffing wheel and some Meguiar's Plastics polish. When I'm done, I will wash the polish off with some dish soap and water and then check to be sure everything looks correct. With the windshield done, I can now start working on the base. If these wheels were in better shape, I might have tried to save them, but in the end they were pretty reamed out and wobbly, and I really wanted some nice wheels to go with the paint, so I'll remove these original wheels and axles by grinding off the 2 tabs holding them in place. To do this, I'll use a Dremel and a burr sphere. I want to raise the wheels and axles and thus lower the car. To do this, I need to place a small piece of brass tubing where the axle originally was. I'm only raising the wheel the thickness of the tubing wall, but it's always amazing how this small amount changes the overall look of the car so drastically. Not to mention, I'll also be putting in some slightly bigger wheels to fill out the wheel wells. To make room for the tubing, I'll use a micro diamond needle file. This can be a pain to get started, but eventually I'll have removed all the material down to the floor of the base. I can then test fit the tubing, and if I'm happy, I can make a mark where I want to cut the tubing. I find the best way to cut this tubing is with a small cutoff wheel in my Dremel. This can cut through the tubing without collapsing it. I will note though that it does heat the tubing up really fast, so be careful not to burn yourself. Now I need to find some wheels that are the correct size and the correct look for this car. These are some Real Rider wheels that I pulled off of a pop culture model some time ago. I get asked a lot where to go and buy wheels, and there are some people online that make and sell custom wheels, especially on Instagram, but most of us pull them off of other Hot Wheels cars. The wheels I have chosen here have white walls or lines on them. If they were red lines, that might look good, but white lines not so much. Luckily, you can change most of these to black walls by removing the tire and then turning it around and putting it back on, just like in real life. Now that the tires are ready, I can go about putting the axles and wheels together. The axle ends are from the original set of Real Riders. I just cut the axle in half. Each half will go through the wheel and then into the end of the brass tubing. I used to glue them in, but more times than not I would glue the wheel to the axle due to the capillary action drawing the glue between the wheel and axle. Once I have the wheel and axle end in place, I will set the assembly on a small piece of metal. I will then place a cold chisel on top of the brass tubing and then strike it with a plastic hammer. This will collapse the tubing in this spot, pinching against the axle end and holding it in place. If the wheel is too tight, I can use a pair of needle nose pliers to gently pull at the axle end to free the wheel so it will spin unhindered. Once this is done, I will place the chisel over the brass tubing one more time and strike it. This will permanently set the wheel and axle in place. Now before I can glue the assemblies in place, I need to clean up the base as it currently is covered in oxidation. The simplest way for me to do this is to dip it into my electropolishing setup and have it remove all the oxidation for me. After it's done, I will go over the base with some 4/0 steel wool to further polish the metal. When done, the base will look as good as new. With the base clean, I can now glue the wheel and axle assemblies in place using some super glue. I can place the glue in the center of the base and then drop the assemblies in. Again, capillary action will take the glue to the ends of the brass tubing. Once I have both of them in place, I will set the base aside and let the glue cure. Once it's completely cured, I can go about putting this car back together. Now off camera, I did go ahead and paint in the front grille black. Given how dark the paint is on the car, you can barely tell I did it. At this point, I'm not going to paint in the tail lights because I'm not done with this car just yet. I would like to put some decals on that I would be printing off on my new decal printer. This printer can actually print white, so I can print any decal I wish on regular transparent decal paper. I want to do a separate video on using this printer, and I wanted to give you guys the opportunity to produce the decal I put on it. If you're interested in giving it a go, then you'll need to create the image in Adobe Illustrator, and then you can send it to me at an email address I'll be leaving in the video description below. I'm looking for an image that will go across the top of the car, covering the hood and roof. If you're interested, please let me know. I'll probably start working on that video in about 2 weeks. I reserve the right to pick the image I like if multiple images are submitted, but more than likely you'll see your image on some car in the future if you submit one. Well anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this restoration/custom. Let me know your thoughts on this color changing paint. I know John over at the Redline shop has put a lot of effort into making it. I will leave links below if you're interested in giving it a try on your next project. Hey, thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.